Good evening, everyone. It's lovely to have you with us. Chanukah Sameach, at a very interesting time at the moment. I'm delighted to be joined this evening by Natan Sharansky and Gil Troy, also by Malcolm Margolis and representatives of their publisher, Public Affairs New York. In my teens and early student years, campaigning for Natan Sharansky's freedom was a part of my Jewish purpose in life. Visiting Refuseniks was a rite of passage for madrichim of youth organizations. Natan Sharansky is a brilliant mathematician whose analytical skills have seen him triumph in chess, on the board, and in real life, in brinksmanship with the KGB and bridge building in Israel. He spent 9 years in Soviet prisons, 9 years in Israeli politics, and then 9 years as chair of the Jewish Agency. I found his recent book, Never Alone, fascinating and inspiring. It's biographical, it's a statement on the Jewish condition in Israel and diaspora, and I also found it to be surprisingly spiritual. We're delighted to welcome Natan's collaborator in Never Alone, award-winning political historian and Zionist commentator Gil Troy. Gil is an expert on American presidents and their campaigns. His history of American presidential elections, 1789 to 2008, runs to 3 volumes. When he gets around to it, I think the 2020 election might run to another 3. He's written about presidential couples and why moderates make the best leaders. As well as a professor of American history, he's author of The Zionist Ideas, Visions for the Jewish Homeland, Then, Now, Tomorrow. Professor Owen Cutler, who was Minister of Justice and Attorney General in Canada, as well as a leading advocate for, amongst others, Nelson Mandela, Jacobo Timmerman, and Natan Sharansky, describes this book of Gil's as a Zionist Bible for the 21st century. So welcome to both of you.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.
Thank you.
Let me just, a couple more
Chag
people
Sameach.
in the room there. So Natan, I found your book absolutely riveting. I've enjoyed it. I've read it now a couple of times. And you describe it as an ongoing conversation between Israel and the Jewish people on faith, identity, and freedom. And particularly on this Chag of Chanukah, I think it would be appropriate for you to describe what you mean by this ongoing conversation.
Well, I really had unique opportunity of being deprived of any identity for the first almost 20 years of my life. And living in the country where there was nothing Jewish, but also there was no freedom. And the only Jewish thing which was anti-Semitism. And the result learning that the only thing which you can do is to be the best in your profession and somehow to adjust to this reality. And then suddenly discovering your identity and discovering how much power is in this feeling of belonging to this unique history and belonging to this family of people who are dispersed all over the world, but who are coming and saying, we are family, we want to help you. And of course, the state of Israel, which is ready to send airplanes to the end of the world, but to save you. And that what gave you strength, gave me strength to fight for my rights, for rights of other Jews, and simply for human rights in the Soviet Union. And what's more important, that when I was isolated, when I was in prison, when for years KGB was explaining to me that I'm abandoned by everybody, that my life is fully in their hands. And that's why I have to agree with their noble compromise of saving your life by becoming again loyal Soviet citizen. I knew that they're lying, that I had intense dialogue with Jewish people, of all the Jewish people in the world, while being in prison. I imagined how they continue the struggle. This imagined world happened to be the real world. And that's why I also then, after this, it was very easy for me to feel yourself in constant dialogue with Jewish people when you're in the government trying to speak to Jewish people in the name of the government, and when you're the head of Jewish agency trying to speak to Israeli government in the name of Jewish people. And so it was all the conversation from different perspectives between Israel and Jewish people. And that's why at the end of my career in Jewish agency, when there were so many voices, and still are, that, oh, they are betraying our state among Jews of diaspora, oh, this government is betraying our Jewish value from the Jews, from Israel government, Jews of diaspora. And there is all the time the question, are we really converging or are we diverging? Or are we one people or not? And because I had this unique perspective of seeing it from different sides at the same time, I felt that, yes, we, with all our disagreements, differences, we want to continue our march, our journey through history together, the Jewish family. And that's when I invited Gil Troy to join me and to write this book.
Excellent. Gil, what inspired you to get involved in Zionist activist writing?
Like so many of you on the call, I was lucky. I was born in freedom. I was lucky. I was born in the United States of America. I know many of you were born in the UK. And we're really what Leon Wieseltier calls the spoiled brats of Jewish history. Born into freedom, born into prosperity, born into a country which accepted us in a very fundamental way. With all the anti-Semitism that we know exists in the UK and the US, it's still like those countries, Canada, Australia also, are like no other countries in world history. And nevertheless, I was born a Zionist. I was born into a Zionist family. I actually say that I'm in favor of mixed marriage because my father was from Beitar, the right-wing Zionist youth movement, and my mother was from Habonim, the left-wing Zionist youth movement. I was from Young Judea, the mainstream Zionist youth movement, and I married someone from Hashomer Tzeir, the left-wing Zionist youth movement. And today our kids are in Bnei Akiva, the religious Zionist youth movement. So we really cover the gamut, but we were part of this broad conversation about how lucky we are to be living in the era of the Third Jewish Commonwealth. How lucky we are to have this opportunity to defend, perfect, learn from, and engage with this state of Israel. And so in a sense, I ran two careers. As Gil Troy, you know, I get great reception at Greek restaurants. I can pass, I can hide, I can be an American historian and an expert in the presidency. But at the same time, I'm also, my Christian name, if you will, Gilad Troyansky. My father gave our name an Ansky-ectomy, and he, as a confused Zionist himself, gave me a Hebrew name, Gilad, which I always cut to Gil, because I wanted to pass, I wanted to fit in, but I also wanted to stand out. And at a certain point, especially in the worst days of what we call the Second Intifada, but I don't like that name because that's the Palestinian name of the uprising against the oppression. So I call it the riots against Oslo, the terrorism against peace. I had a choice. In Montreal, the attacks on Israel were mounting. There was no understanding of all Israel had done to try to make peace with the Palestinians. And as soon as Yasser Arafat led his people back to terror in 2000, we were guilty. And I could hide behind my name, Gil Troy, or I could stand up and say, I am a Zionist. And indeed, almost about 20 years ago, I wrote an essay in the Montreal Gazette saying, I am a Zionist, standing up and embracing that identity. And that's actually how I ended up meeting Natan, who at the time was Diaspora Affairs Minister. And we worked together a little bit. And from there, our friendship grew, especially when I went with my wife, four kids, and I went on sabbatical a few years ago, and we never quite succeeded in leaving Israel, and now we're Olim. So that's the very short version of a very long love story between me, the Jewish people, and the state of Israel.
Wonderful. So that leads into Natan. You had to make a very difficult decision when you applied for Aliyah, you know, outing yourself completely from the quasi comfort of being an academic in Russia. You know, you were able to hide up to a point, until the point where you ask for a letter identifying you to be able to emigrate. And it goes back a long time, but what did it feel like to make the statement, Hineni, here I am, this is who I am?
Well, yes, we describe it in my book, in our book, Never Alone, that strange moment. After all, in my life, after that moment, I had to make many very difficult decisions to how tough to be with the KGB. When they arrest you and give you a choice, or life or death, and why you have what you will choose. Or when some my Israeli partners in the struggle demand from me stop being involved in the human rights movement, be only Zionist. And some leading dissidents are saying, stop being nationalist, you're one of us, be universalist. And I have to decide, no, I will go my way. It was all very difficult decisions. But it's strange that by far the most difficult, psychological, the most difficult decisions was not about to choose life and choose death in prison. The most difficult decision was when I finally had to declare about myself, to ask technical formal thing, the paper in your place of your job, that you're beginning this process of applying for visa to Israel. But that meant that publicly finally you'll say that you're not going to be a loyal citizen anymore. You're doing something which is absolute crime in the eyes of this society, that you'll decide that you don't want to live in this country. What means the end of your professional career, the end of this dream to beat anti-Semitism by becoming the best in your profession. And meaning that now all your life will be a life of uncertainty. You don't know whether you'll be permitted. You don't know whether you'll be arrested. You don't know what will happen to you. But that is the moment when you cross the line between loyal Soviet citizen, double thinker, the one who doesn't believe in this ideology, but is lying all his life for the sake of career, and a dissident, the one who is, it seems like very vulnerable, but is a free person because he says what he really thinks. It was very dramatic for me. It was very difficult to make this step. It's the only time in my life when I took special, pill which makes you relax. They will not be so tense that you cannot even come and to say to your very friendly boss, all you have to say, please give me this paper which I technically need to start the process of applying for visa to Israel. But that was like the end of the old world, of the old life. You're destroying all that life. You're now belong to different world. And in fact, that world, though, immediately you're losing your work, you're searched, you're interrogated, many of your friends will be afraid to have any contacts with you, but you start the life of free person. And what's most important is the person who has his own history, who has his people, who has the aim, and he will finally can enjoy freedom, doing things that he really believes in. But so that was this dramatic crossing from the life of loyal Soviet citizen to the life of Jewish activist.
So did you think it out like a chess player? When I do this, this is what's going to happen, and this is what's going to happen, this is what's going to happen, and I'm going to make a short-term sacrifice for the long-term future, or was it more motivated?
At that moment, you really, that moment, it has to be something irrational, because rationally you cannot count all the moves. You have no idea what's happening with you. But irrationally, you feel that now you want to be a free person. You cannot continue this permanent life of lies, of compromises, which are in fact erasing you as an individual. And yes, at that moment you have to decide, no, I don't want to continue this life of loyal Soviet slave anymore. the only way to become now a free person is to make this step, the first step. Of course, I did hope, and I made all types of rational steps to succeed, but you can't predict. Later, of course, when you're already inside this life and you start comparing different strategies vis-a-vis KGB, and when you are a spokesman of your movement, so you have to take into account the possible influence of our statements on the Jewish world and the power of Jewish world to influence on the policy of the Soviet Union. Of course, there is a lot of calculations. But first, you have to decide in principle that there is no material price in this. Are you going to continue to live as a slave, or you will become a free person?
So you describe it, Natan, as a sort of visceral Maccabee moment. You know, this comes from within me. I need to stand up. I need to fight for my moment and for my identity. That's certainly an appropriate image for Hanukkah. Identity and who we are, and what makes us who we are, is a really important idea in the Jewish world and the wider world today. And, you know, the identity that has come from oppression, or the identity that came out of the Shoah, or the identity that I grew up with campaigning for Jewish freedoms and against anti-Zionism, what do we fight for now? What is the unifying cause for the Jewish world that we can rally people behind? And let me throw this one out initially to Gil, because you listed just about every Jewish youth movement that ever there was there. And certainly now I get to see how you were able to write your book on Zionist visions, because you and your family cover just about the whole gamut there. But what is there for us to unify ourselves around?
Well, this is actually one of the central themes of our book. You know, we call our book, we've made up a word, we call it either a manifestoir or a memoir festo, which is we're taking this life story of Natan's love affair with the Jewish people and using it to tell broader stories about what we need to stand for today. And dialogue, if dialogue for the sake of just jawboning is pointless, we are trying to search for some kind of meaning. And I'd say we go in two directions. One is we absolutely have to fight our enemies, right? And one of the things I want to do is say how moved I think both of us are to be on a call with people from the UK, because you talk about Maccabee moment. All of you are modern Maccabees. You as a community stood up in a way, frankly, I don't think the American Jewish community would, against Jeremy Corbyn, and stood up very effectively. And I know some were labor supporters for decades who said this shall not stand. And some were longtime labor critics who said this shall not stand. And I think you did a tremendous job that the rest of the Jewish world should learn from. So unfortunately, we still have a very long agenda based on our enemies. But I think what we're really pushing for in this book, and what I think both what motivates Natan and me in very fundamental ways, is the jujitsu, J-E-W, taking the negative and turning it into a positive. We don't want an identity built on anti-Semitism. We don't want an identity built on anti-Zionism. We want an identity based on a positive vision, a search for meaning. And in our work with college students, I from the campus, Natan as an outside advisor and an inspiring force on campus, we see how many students, how many of our young people are lost. We know that in the UK, you had a minister of loneliness put in a few years ago. I don't know if you still have it, but think about that. Think about how many of our young people, how many of our friends, how many of our colleagues are adrift, and how countercultural Jewish culture is, Jewish community is, Jewish synagogues like yours are. And so I think ultimately what we really want people to rally around is the sense of peoplehood. And that comes to the essential title of the book, Never Alone. Wherever you are, whatever you do, whatever you feel, you know you're part of this amazing network called the Jewish people. And we're not arrogant enough to say we're better. What we are special, and we are part of a unique conversation that has been going on for thousands of years. And whatever differences we might have, and we certainly have differences over the Kotel and over Reform and conservative and Orthodox and United Synagogue and all that, the way it plays out in the UK and the way it plays out in Canada, the way it plays out in the US, differences over what to do with the Palestinians and territory, but we all want to keep the conversation going because we all want to keep the Jewish people alive. So ultimately, in a word, meaning. Not just fighting our enemies, but finding meaning in this crazy world. And that's what identity is. Freedom opens up the possibility. Freedom is the potential. Freedom is the air we breathe. But identity is the meal. Identity is the substance. Identity is the essence that we're all searching, that gives us a sense of meaning and a common conversational base.
Natan, what do you think are the key forces that will unify us and within identity?
Yes.
And go on.
Yeah, well, I agree with Gil, and again, it seems that there are such different worlds, the world of the struggle for Soviet Jewry and today. But in fact, the struggle is the same struggle. Our desire to be one family, Jewish family, in freedom, continuing our journey, influencing the world with our values. That's our challenge for the last more than 2,000 years, or 3,000 years. And the fact to understand that the real freedom is inseparable from identity. When you say that some people, many people identify their identity as something negative. For example, I grew in the atmosphere of anti-Semitism. So solidarity of people who suffered from anti-Semitism. Okay, but then your desire can be to defeat your enemies or simply to make these enemies to forget that you're a Jew. And the assimilation is as good answer. In Soviet Union, many generation of our parents were looking for any way to write in the idea of their children somehow, instead of the word Jew, the word Russian or Ukrainian or Armenian or Georgian, doesn't matter what, because nationality didn't matter. What really mattered, that Jew is a problem. You're born as a Jew, it is a problem. So it is our enemies who are defining our identity for us, and really our aim can be only to survive. And so we are looking for the ways to survive, which happens to be good in profession. When we rediscovered after 1967 war, started reading in the underground from the books which were brought by tourists, Jewish tourists from America, from Britain, from any other country. So we started reading the books about this unique history, and you understand that if you want, it will be your history. It's so interesting, it's so meaningful. And then to take this history all through up to today, to the liberation of Jerusalem, you look at these soldiers, they are of your age, they're 20 years old, and they're part of this unique, great history, and you can be part of this history. And then you find out all these Jews who are coming from Miami, Sydney, or London, they're saying, oh, your father is from Odessa, and my grandfather is from Odessa. We are family, we want to help you. And that if only you'll decide, these are people of your family. And look what great values they brought to the world, what made really the world free, what made the world feel that human life is the highest value. So it can be all yours. And of course, the state of Israel. So when your identity is something very positive, it's suddenly your life has meaning, and then you have real strength to fight for the freedom in this world. So for me, it was absolutely inseparable, identity and freedom. More than this, I would say that in prison, when you don't know on whom you can rely, who is the informer of KGB and who is not. Even when you're not in prison, you don't know who is informer of KGB, because there were millions of people working for KGB. But in prison, for sure, you can't know. And then you understand, you realize that people with strong identities, some Christians from Lithuania or Muslims from Crimea or Ukrainian nationals, people with very strong identity, the stronger the identity, the less the chance that they're working for KGB. Because exactly as you have values which are more important for you than your physical survival, they also have values which are more important for them than physical survival. And that's why people with strong identities who believe in freedom, who believe in democracy, these are your real allies. So for me, it became very clear that if you really want to change the world to a more free place, you have to have the only source for this strength to change the world is your identity. And that's why this polarization in today's world, that this insistence in Europe, it's very often that for the sake of freedom and peace, we should give up our strong identities. Or to the contrary, in the Middle East, for the sake of our strong identities, we should give up for human rights. It's not us. We are those who are trying to connect these two worlds.
So I see a tension with identity. And the tension is that many of our children are growing up now with absolute freedom. And there's nothing to worry about. Most of the Jewish world is relatively affluent. There's a sense that we're citizens of the world. What is it that makes us inherently Jewish? How do we have the Jewish story come through? And you know, I say that because there are so many different forms of identity that are being championed at the moment. My sexuality or my politics, my global vision. What is the Jewish story? And I just want to prompt you on this a little bit, Natan and Gil. You know, you wrote, Natan, how much you were moved by reading Leon Uris's book Exodus, which you described as quite mushy and emotional. And then you champion the birthright program. It's one of the things that as a minister and then later in the Jewish agency you were a powerful advocate for, which has a strong emotional tie. What's the emotional story that we bring to the fore at the moment?
Natan, start.
You want Gil to start or me? Whatever. Gil, you want to start?
Gil, jump in.
You are involved to birthright day and night.
Okay.
Well, okay, I can.
You start and then I'll
Okay.
continue. So, Natan.
Look, it's good to speak about universal freedom and that I'm a citizen of the world. If you're a citizen of the world and of no specific place, you're not in this world. Now, to be in this world, you have to be somewhere, to be connected to somewhere, to be rooted somewhere. And the life of uprooted person, in the end, is a life without any values. The dream, which was brought from Britain by John Lennon to the free world, was imagine the world without borders, without governments, without God, without religion, the world where there is nothing to die for. And so many people tried to live where there is nothing to die for, and soon their life was becoming very superficial, very decadent, without real any values. If you are not ready to fight for something, to die for something, there is no meaning in living. The life becomes absolutely empty. And you cannot change anything in this world because if you're not ready to risk your life for anything, so you cannot defend anything. And definitely you cannot defend the peace. Definitely you cannot defend the freedom. And I was lucky. I discovered it very early how much strength you can find in fighting for the better world, in finding your identity. But birthright is a very good example, and we describe in our book in details how this idea was born. And this idea was born in the minds of two American Jews who realized that with all their effort, they didn't succeed to pass to their children the passion for being Jewish. And then they discovered that when they bring their children to Israel, Israel does it for them. It doesn't depend on the policy or politics of Israeli government. It doesn't depend on anything else. What happens to them? I think happened something similar to what happened to us in the Soviet Union. Suddenly these people discover that they have history. It's so easy in Israel to discover that there is history of 1,000 years. And that this history goes straight to a very modern society and a very interesting society. And there are all these types of the Jews. And as some people, and we quote them and birthrights, so I find place where I'm loved not for my views, because it doesn't matter what your views, whether you're on the left or right, or where they are very religious, absolutely secular. There are enough people of your views in Israel who are authentic Jews. And then you find out how it can give you the strength to be part of the fighting family for those ideals in which you really believe. So yeah, I think we Jews, we are really very lucky. We have such a history which can help, which is very interesting, at the same time helps us to be the people of universe. We're just in the days of Hanukkah. It's so sensible to at the times of Hanukkah to say we are only religion or we are only nation. If you are only religion, you cannot celebrate Hanukkah. If you are only nation, you cannot celebrate Hanukkah. There are miracles and fight for your national pride and state and fight to be free from totalitarian regime. All this at the same time. There is identity, there is freedom. There is a religion, there is state. So our tradition simply helps us very much to fight for the universal ideas based on our national roots. Gil?
So first, Rabbi, I want to thank you. You've done such a very clear and sensitive reading of the book, and I can tell you got to the end. Sometimes interviews just stop at the first 50 pages. So kol hakavod and thank you. Secondly, I want to point out one of the extraordinary things about this collaboration that I've been so privileged to have with Natan is, despite us coming from very different worlds, ideologically, we're very much on the same page. We fought in writing this book lovingly over wording, over structure, over how to tell the story, but ideologically, fundamentally, we really have a very similar vision, as you're going to hear. And if I could just pull back the camera lens and put this in historic perspective, since the Enlightenment, since Jews left the ghetto, there has been this kind of Jewish desire to fit in, to be indeed that phrase that you used, Rabbi, a citizen of the world. So a joke that I like to tell for modern university students, which actually is taken from traveling salesmen in the 1930s, is there are three modern university students. They're freshmen, that's the language we use in the US, and they're sitting around and finally they start talking about religion. And one of them says, hi, my name is Jane, I'm a Catholic. And one of them says, hi, my name is Muhammad, I'm a Muslim. And the third says, hi, my name is Ben, I'm a citizen of the world. And the other two look and go, oh, a Jew, right? And that need for us to somehow feel that in order to fit in, we have to negate who we are. Is a Jewish crank, is a Jewish weakness. And indeed, I agree with Natan that my mother warned me, if you're too open-minded, your brains fall out. That the best way to achieve tikkun olam, the best way to connect, the best way also to pass on values is not by imagine, is not by opening your arms so much that you lose balance, but by hugging and by closing in. And that's our failure today, I'm sorry to say. Most of us don't tell, and you use the key word, Rabbi, story. We don't tell our story. We don't tell the extraordinary story of the Jewish people. We don't tell this amazing adventure, the 72-year-old adventure of the modern state of Israel. And we don't tell our story. We've been on so many calls with people who were part of the 35, that group of powerful, mostly women in London and in Canada who fought so hard for Natan. We've been on calls with the 250,000 Jews, some of the 250,000 Jews who were at the March in Washington 33 years ago, and they didn't tell their kids about it. They didn't tell their grandkids about it. And then they say, oh my goodness, how come nobody knows? So indeed, it has to be with the head and it has to be with the heart. And the linkage between the head and the heart is the story. The story conveys the emotion, and the story conveys the essence, the substance. And we look, and indeed, Hanukkah, Purim, these are stories, right? We are the world's great storytellers, but only if we exercise that muscle. And not enough of us exercise that muscle. And then when we get to selling the birthright, we get to this essential insight. One, that because of all this openness, a generation has really failed their kids. People like to say, oh, what about the kids? I always say, what about the parents and the grandparents? And indeed, Charles Bronfman and Michael Steinhardt, who had everything in the world, saw they hadn't given their kids that essence. And to use the delicious phrase of the late Lord Jonathan Sacks, he said, Israel becomes our classroom. And that's the birthright insight, that wherever you'll live, wherever you are ideologically, when you come to Israel and you're living Judaism 24/7, 365 days a year, in 3D, Israel becomes our classroom, becomes a full-time seminar. And so birthright participants have a chance to go from being nothings to being somethings. Not through a heavy hand, but from a welcoming. And it's, yes, using Israel as the platform and Jewish identity as the platform, and saying, we're not just giving you a free ticket to come to Israel. And we're not just saying, oh, here, come for 10 days. You go on a bus with 39 other young Jews, and you meet 5, 7, 8, 10 other Israelis. Because Judaism is not just done through the I, but done through the us. It's not just us story or my story, it's our story. And that's why Birthright has been so successful with 750,000 participants, obviously until COVID, but this is just a temporary hiccup. And we know that there's already a long waiting list of people who are anxious to get back and engage. And my kids thought Birthright was a 3 or 4 or 5 month program because they couldn't believe how many transformational stories they heard from Birthright participants who've come to our house, who've been with us for Havdalah. They said they did it in a day, in 3 days, in 5 days, in 10 days. And I said, yes, this shows how blank they were and how, as Natan says, how much they were yearning for something, just like he was in the Soviet Union. And you see it in their eyes. They're welcomed. They're part of something. They've learned they're never alone.
So in your book, Natan, you describe the tension of the announcement that is going to be made to enable Jews of all religious colors to be able to daven at the Kotel. And it's about to be announced. And you've been working on this for years. And this is what Gil has been talking about, our story, it's our center, it's our Israel. And then at the same time, there is a political sideswipe that sees Bibi have to change tack. And I'm going to ask you about your relationship with Bibi shortly, but Bibi has to change tack and undermine the promises that have been made to you because the religious community is saying this is our story, this is our state, this is our Kotel, and we need to be clear on who is a Jew. And I can see there's a tension between the story of the Yiddishkeit on the one hand that is holding the reins in Israel, and the Yiddishkeit that enables everybody to be part of it, that's part of the birthright story. Natan, how did you deal with that? And how do we deal with that?
Well, first of all, it's much more dramatic than you just now described. You made it very easy
to buy the book.
For Prime Minister. What you said, that Prime Minister promised to me something and then took it away. Well, okay, look, after all, what is his promise to me in comparison with his obligations as Prime Minister? No, it was not like this. Prime Minister understood that it's absolutely impossible situation, that the Jews are beating one another near the Kotel. He called me and said, Natan, I cannot stand this situation anymore. You are a Jewish agency, you have the opportunity to talk to all these people. Please try to see if we can bring them to the negotiation table. And after some months of talking to all the sides, I came to Prime Minister and said, these are the conditions on which we can bring them to negotiations table. And the negotiations will start if you will accept these preliminary conditions from both sides. And he accepted them. And for 4 years, we had negotiations. And Bibi Netanyahu, prime minister, was not only initiated these negotiations, he saved these negotiations a number of times when they were in the deadlock. He was very inventive because he wanted this solution, because he wanted that Jews will stop fighting with one another, that it was his phrase, which he formulated me as a task, which is one wall for one people. And more than this, and the government made a decision. Prime Minister used all his political weight in order the government will make a decision to approve this compromise. After this, when it came to the question of implementation, and religious parties who at the moment, let's say, of weakness, agreed not to resist to this decision, to abstain and not to bring it down, suddenly, well, because of a number of reasons, changed their mind. And Prime Minister at some moment decided that after he, not only that he promised to me, not only that he promised for a few years to all the leaders of liberal Jewish communities, on every public meeting, but when the government already passed this decision and the compromise became the law of the state, after this, he decided that saving of the coalition is more important, and he retreated. He said, I don't want to cancel this decision, but I propose to freeze this decision. And the same ministers who a year ago voted for this decision voted for freezing this decision. So the drama is much more big. And as practically with everything in this book, the moment we describe from inside all this decision process and all these arguments from both sides, and which I heard and in which I was involved, we immediately then turn the chessboard and now try to see it in the eyes of Prime Minister. Because at the same time, when this conflict was developing, there was another conflict about the Iran. And when all the forces in Israel agreed that that agreement between America and Iran is very bad for the security of Israel, American Jews supported their president. And at some moment, Prime Minister told me, but don't you see that these people really don't like Israel? I became very angry. I said, how dare you to say it? Israel is their identity. He said, but they like Israel, which exists in their imagination. The real Israel, which has to fight their enemies, they really don't like. So it was drama on both sides. On one hand, many Jewish communities in the world, definitely all the liberal Jewish communities, felt themselves absolutely betrayed by Israeli government. And they were absolutely furious. After all, there were few thousand community organizers or rabbis of the Reformed conservative communities, few thousand, who were told by Prime Minister, sit silent, don't protest, we'll have a compromise. And their leaders who were participating in the compromise did it, delivered it. And then Prime Minister does such thing, they felt betrayed. On the other hand, this time, the government felt that with all these nice talks, but when it comes to the death and life issue of Israel, they're not with us. So that is the drama on both sides, and that's how we describe it in our book. Look, as to the specific quota compromise, I believed that that's the easiest question in the questions of religion state, because in fact, it doesn't need any ideological concession from any side. It's, after all, it's only about giving opportunity to everybody to pray in the way in which he or she used to pray, this most symbolic for a nation and for religion, most symbolic place for Jews in the world. It was possible, it is possible, and I'm sure that with some political changes which are happening, exactly this compromise, because there was invested so much by all the sides, and it is so simple, it's so simple for implementation, it will be reached. But the more important thing is how we will keep this feeling of one family when there are such strong forces on both sides, which are, it seems like, acting one against the other. And that's what we are trying to deal with in the book. Gil, you want to add something?
Yeah, one of our controversial points is that, first of all, there are forces of convergence and divergence, that there are things pulling us together and things ripping us apart. And, you know, when we look up close and we see the fight among the elites, the liberal rabbis who are furious about the Kotel, the Haredi politicians who were trying to protect the Kotel, to use their language, and then they go to Birthright. And I actually asked the person who does surveys for Birthright, what do the Birthright participants think about the Kotel controversy? And has their perspective on the Kotel changed since this controversy began? It continues to be not just the highlight of their trip, but the spiritual highlight of their lives. And we saw recent studies that showed that maybe 3 to 4% of the American Jewish community, which seems to be so upset about this, actually cares about the issue. And that's an important warning to us. Sometimes we fall into these fights among the elites. Sometimes we fall into these fights among the insiders, and we think, I know it's the intellectual's conceit. The intellectual conceit is that everything that I think about, everything I'm obsessed about, everybody else is too. I represent the masses. We don't. And so it's actually, what I see sometimes is my colleagues on the left are shooting themselves in the foot because they say, oh, we're fighting for your rights, but what they're actually doing is undermining a basic love for the Jewish people. And my friends on the right are making a similar kind of mistake. They call themselves nationalists, patriots, and yet they often are pulverizing the sense of Jewish unity. And so it's really upon us to fight for our positions, fight for our principles, but also keep this broader feeling of Jewish unity alive. And it's fragile, but it's also very resilient and very strong. And that's the duality we constantly play with in the book.
So a very polarizing feature in Jewish Israel thought at the moment is the current president of the United States of America. You know, for many people, and indeed a few years ago, a large number of rabbis spoke out about a boorish personality and values which just seem to fly in the face of Torah standards. On the other hand, despite all that, the last couple of years have seen a catalyzing of strength for Israel and the embassy moving to Jerusalem and peace agreements with countries around us, to the extent that in the height of a pandemic, people are able to go to Abu Dhabi or wherever to Dubai, sorry, for weddings and the chasnas at the moment, and Pesach in Dubai is being advertised for next year. So things that we never would have imagined. You know, Trump, good or bad?
Well, our book resists simple answers. The simple answers don't help to anybody. To the contrary, they help to polarize people to go in their camp and not to see anything else. Yes, but we write a lot about this paradox, like when American Jews are angry on Israel that Israel's prime minister was against the president that they loved and declared as the best friend of Israel the president whom they hate. But look, yes, it is true that President Trump, I think, is a big problem as a personality, as a president, is a big problem for any representative of the liberal, not only Jewish community, but of those for whom liberal values of America are dear. At the same time, no doubt that the same president did things unprecedented in the Middle East, which really changed all this paradigm, which says that Israel has to accept demands of Palestinian Authority, otherwise there never will be peace between Israel and Muslim world, and as a result, there always will be tension between the free world and Muslim world. And that's why free world has to force Israel to make the necessary concessions for the peace, which was paradigm accepted almost by all the free world, paradigm which was extremely, absolutely wrong and extremely dangerous for the security of Israel. And we in this book say no words for criticizing Oslo Agreement. In fact, we have a phrase which was very difficult for many liberals to accept, that if there is one crime which Israel did to Palestinian people, it's Oslo Agreement. So we don't believe in agreement which is built on imposing corrupt dictator on Palestinian people. Now, at the same time, and we couldn't cover it in our book, though there were some hints about, but it didn't happen when we finished the book. It happened after we finished the book. Abraham Accords are principally different. Yes, they are with non-democratic states. We cannot impose democracy on anyone. We can have our sympathy to the people who are fighting against dictatorship, but we didn't bring these dictatorial regimes. But this is the peace which is built from bottom up. When people decide, speak against this dogma that as long as Israel didn't have peace with Palestinians, it will never have peace with us. And people are permitted to express openly their desire to have business, to have tourism, to have film productions together, to enjoy one another's opportunities. And that's type of, which is called normalization, but it's a real peace process which starts from people to people. And the fact that it happened under the leadership of the president, who is so problematic for liberal democracy, because it is the fact which we have analyzed as it is, and not saying, but is he in the end good or bad? We have to learn what was good in it and what new administration, which hopefully will be less polarizing, has to learn. And we do hope that new administration will not go blind to resume the agreements which created so many problems for Israeli security. And we do hope that this administration, being very different, hopefully, than Trump for liberalism and democracy in the United States of America, will continue the policy of supporting normalization, which of course is very different than the old paradigm. And you cannot solve these problems by giving one color. Was it black or was it right? Gil, you want to continue?
We just read in the Torah portion this week about Joseph, who is the hero of the story, but here's this hero who gets saved and doesn't bother trying to get in touch with his father for all these years and lets his father live in tremendous anguish mourning the son who actually isn't dead. We've just finished this whole series of biblical stories of very problematic characters who also are our founding fathers and mothers. So, I would say my Rebbe on this is Ed Koch, the former mayor of New York, who said, if you agree with me on 7 of 12 things, please vote for me. If you agree with me on 12 of 12 things, please see a psychiatrist. And the unfortunate fact is that there are actually very few rabbis in the United States today who would have been able to formulate the question with the elegance and sensitivity and subtlety that you just did, Rabbi. Because in the US, I would either hear from Orthodox rabbis who would just talk about Donald Trump's greatness and not acknowledge his failure with his midot, with his morality, or I would hear from Reform and conservative rabbis who would be so busy trashing Donald Trump they couldn't even thank him when he moved the embassy to Jerusalem. And so we need to be able to be like F. Scott Fitzgerald, the great American author, who said the mark of a true intelligence is to hold 2 contradictory thoughts in your head. We see the good that Trump did, and we see the harm that he did. And we hope that the good will outlast the harm. And you, our friends in the UK, have a very important role to play here. Having made a very important stand against anti-Semitism, I think the next frontier, or the emerging frontier already there, is on BDS, on boycott. And they're going to start with a boycott of just Golan Heights or just the West Bank. And I would like to throw out the phrase from the former president of Harvard, Larry Summers, who warned that most Israel boycott, which are anti-Israel boycott initiatives, are anti-Semitic in effect, if not in intent. And the Palestinians, on the whole, the Palestinian leadership and the students, the far left students who support the Palestinians, are not going to look at the Abraham Accords and say, oh my goodness, I now see a path to peace, which involves person-to-person contacts, which involves cultural ties, economic ties, which involves giving Arabs jobs, Palestinians jobs. No, I fear that they're going to double down on their approach. The pressure for anti-normalization is going to be greater. The peace now position is going to be to boycott settlements and boycott any fruit, any wine, any lovely products that come from these evil settlers. And that's a way of creating a bridgehead to have a boycott against Israel in general. And we need your voice, because it's not going to start so much in the United States, it's going to start in Europe, and it's going to start in the UK. And we need your voice to stand up and say, this is unacceptable. We smell the smell of anti-Semitism. We know that Israel is being singled out. We know the territories are being singled out. We don't hear a boycott about China for all the horrific things they do with demonstrators in Hong Kong or Muslim Uyghurs or Tibetans. We don't hear a boycott of Syrian products, not there are that many on the market these days. We don't hear boycotts about anybody else except for the Jew. And we need your voice there. So, and that's the spirit. So, and I don't care where you stand on the settlements. You could disagree. In fact, I need people who say, you know what, I'm against the settlements as they currently are, but nevertheless, I'm also against boycott, because we need our friends on the left fighting left-wing anti-Semitism and our friends on the right fighting right-wing anti-Semitism. We need to clean house. That's the way to do it, not to just demonize the other who's not going to listen to you in the first place.
Just on the previous point, I loved a quotation in the book where it says, our job as leaders and human rights advocates is to cope with reality, no matter how ugly, while searching for just and lasting solutions. And you talked about that in the context of Oslo as a moral failure, but at the same time in the context of saying that the importance of an ongoing peace process needs to be one where the Palestinians have democratic leadership. And not just giving money to the residual terrorist organizations that hold sway there. Coming on to the contemporary anti-Semitism, you talk about campuses canceling and the new anti-Semitism as a real problem, and then the 3Ds. Perhaps you could elaborate a little bit what those 3Ds are.
Natan.
Yeah. Well, one of the most important things today, which I faced 20 years ago, is how fighting the anti-Semitism, not to let it hide under the pretext that we are legitimately criticizing Israel. And in fact, the highest moments of the Second Intifada, when I was the minister traveling all over the campuses, and I found how at the time when Israel, every day in Israel, there were another 20, 30 victims of suicide bombing, and Israel was on the forefront of the struggle against global terrorism. I saw so many students in the campuses embarrassed or perplexed by anti-Israeli propaganda in its most extreme form, when it was called Nazi state, when the biggest massacre since the Second World War, that's what Israel is doing to Palestinians. And of course, it was all lies, but it was lies which were perplexing, which were confusing Jewish students, and some of them were saying, maybe it would be better if Israel doesn't exist, because then we are not connected to all this. And whenever you criticize these extreme forms of and absolute unjust forms of criticism of Israel and saying it's modern anti-Semitism. Look, you're drawing Ariel Sharon eating Palestinian kids and the blood dropping from his mouth exactly from the cartoons of Hitler. Or when representative of the European Union says, I was in Palestinian refugee camp, that is Auschwitz of today, saying, wait a minute, I was many times in Palestinian camp. It's disgrace that fifth generation of Palestinians lives in refugee camps. And let's discuss why it is so, who is guilty, what we can do, but what it has to do with Auschwitz. And that is anti-Semitism. And they say, no, it's not anti-Semitism, it's criticism of Israel. And then I propose my 3Ds, which later became the base of the modern definition of new anti-Semitism, that demonization, delegitimization, double standard. You can criticize as much as you want. We in Israel are doing it every day, every moment. But why do we need to demonize Israel? That's exactly what anti-Semites were doing to Jews, turning them in kind of demons. Why do we need to delegitimize Israel, to deprive it of its right to exist? That's exactly what Stalin was trying to do to Jews as a nation, saying Jews are not a nation. There is no such a nation. And here saying that it's not a legitimate state. Or why are you applying standard to Israel, which you never apply to America, to Britain, or to Iran, not to dictatorships, not to democracies. So how it can be, and there is a lot of explanations behind it. Some of them we are bringing in our book. But so that's what we propose. Let's see that there will be, that if the same principles which were applied by anti-Semites to Jews are applied to Jewish state as a collective Jew, that's anti-Semitism today. And the problem is that today, 20 years later, when so many countries and the international organization accepted it, this 3D principle in the form of international definition of anti-Semitism with the specific examples, there are Jewish organizations or communities which are saying, you know, they're confused by this criticism, and they say, we cannot really accept this definition of new anti-Semitism, that criticism of Israel in some forms can be also anti-Semitism, because that restricts the freedom of speech. I have to say it's a ridiculous situation. Just in the same day when I received the telephone from Ilan Carr, who is the representative of the fighting of anti-Semitism by the American administration, who told me that they signed the agreement with the Bahrain about fighting anti-Semitism also, and also the legitimization, demonization of the state of Israel, that some forms of anti-Zionism can be anti-Semitic. That's what Bahrain signed. And I said, send me a text. He sent me a text, and I really see that anti-Zionism becomes anti-Semitism. That's the belief of these institutions of Muslim state. And then I'm meeting with the delegation of Bahrain and say, do you realize what you signed, that it's not only about Jews, it's about Jewish state? Of course not, we only realize that's what we want. We want to build normal relations with Jewish state. Why should we support new anti-Semitism? That's what I hear from them. At that very day, I'm receiving email from San Francisco Jewish organization, which had decided that we cannot support this international definition of anti-Semitism because that's what restricts the freedom of speech. So we can have a very unusual situation that fighting with all the forms of anti-Semitism, we are not united as a people as always was about anti-Semitism. We are divided. We are divided on those who are ready to recognize only the old anti-Semitism and those who are ready to fight against anti-Zionism. It will be very unfortunate. And we really have to think about it as the next big challenge for Jewish people, how we together fight against all the forms of anti-Semitism at the same time. Gil, you want to add?
So, yeah, I mean, just to emphasize that it's very important that people understand that sometimes when you give certain guardrails, give certain boundaries, it's not to squelch, but it's actually to invite. So we say there's lots of healthy room for criticism of Israel. There's lots of healthy room for debate about Israel, but use these red lines, use these guardrails to say, okay, we're not going to go so far. We're not going to go overboard. And the other thing we have to emphasize is that, especially when we talk about the campus, there's a tendency to speak in very binary terms, that everybody's against us and that you have to go in fighting and it's us against them. It's the good guys against the bad guys. And I have to say that I, a year and a half ago, back when travel was a verb, had the real privilege of doing a round of a speaking tour at the UK. and through the UK through various universities, thanks to the good offices of the Israeli embassy and the Union of Jewish Students. And I was warned, because I was talking about the Zionist ideas, and we're actually giving out copies of the Zionist ideas. And I was warned from university to university, uh-oh, you're going to face trouble. I get to the University of Warwick in Coventry, and there's a sellout crowd. And the security officials gave me an exit and had a whole plan in the event that things got ugly. We had the most amazing conversation, because rather than assuming that people were coming to attack Israel and coming to attack me and coming to attack Zionism, I treated them as learners, as people who came into the room who wanted to learn about Zionism. And many of them said in the Q&A, you know, I hear about this, I hear it's attacked, but no one ever really bothered explaining it to me. And so sometimes we have to be wary about not creating our own self-fulfilling prophecies. There are times when it's very clear, and we know this has happened again and again on UK campuses, where the attacks are coming in, and we have to be very, very strong, and the 3Ds help us articulate the clear red lines. But we also have to approach situation by situation, smelling, seeing, listening, and responding in a way that's appropriate, and not looking at every student as hostile and not looking at every left-winger as hostile, because it was an overwhelmingly left-wing crowd who wanted to learn. And there were some tough questions. I was asked, you know, how is it that so many Palestinians were killed in 2014 and so few Jews? I said, do you want me to apologize for the fact that Israel defends its own people and that Hamas, rather than building bomb shelters, tries to build underground tunnels to kill my people? I'm not going to do that. So part of it is changing the terms of the conversation, not being defensive, having clear red lines, not just about what's anti-Semitism, but also what we're going to defend and what we're not going to defend.
We're coming towards late in Israel at the moment, and I appreciate your time and your energy, but I know it's not infinite. I want to make an unusual request, and that is, Natan writes about keeping a book of Tehillim with him during his time in prison. And you need to read the stories in his own words about refusing to hand it over and refusing to budge and get on buses unless he could bring the Tehillim with him. And then he writes, you know, I never particularly pictured him as a religious individual. You know, we campaigned for him to be free, but this religious aspect is there. He says that as he gets out of prison, he stops, and in his moment of freedom, he recites Tehillim Perek Lamed, 30th chapter of Psalms, which is Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit LeDavid, which is, we say it every morning, but it's also the psalm that we say on the dedication of the temple and on Hanukkah. And you know, so what's unprecedented is I'm going to ask Natan to read Perek Lamed of Tehillim for us, because I think it's, you know, it touched me. I'm going to share the screen so that you've got it in front of you. But it really touched me to hear from somebody who was, you know, a hero of mine, that he was reading the same psalm as I was reading. And to the extent that, you know, I just talk about his religiosity. He explains why he always wears a green sort of military style cap. That's a picture I took of him in Kiryat Moriah about 30 years ago, and wearing a cap so that he wasn't wearing a hat. He didn't look like a frummer, but he had his head covered. You know, it was all there. So, you know, the fact that he read Tehillim Perek Lamed on freedom, I really wanted to share with you the experience of hearing Natan Sharansky reading.
Okay, then I'll go to my other room. I'll bring my Tehillim and my hat, and then wait a minute. Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. So just during this commercial break, I will take advantage of the commercial break and say that the book, Never Alone, is available. It is remarkable how current it is. I think, and Gil, it goes up to April, May
Yes, it goes to the COVID crisis. There's some insights and learnings about how you cope with this crazy isolation, which who knows how long it'll last.
Right, so it goes into COVID, which is remarkable. It's you know, ad kani, it's up to the moment, and frighteningly so. And
we like to think that it'll last beyond that. It's that the eternal message we're struggling with will be relevant 5 and 10 and 15 years from now as well. We tried to write it that way.
I found it a profoundly inspiring book.
Well,
not only because of the history and the story, but the analysis of the Jewish situation at the moment, and the insights that you and Natan bring to the fore, I think articulate some really important points. And you know, I recommend that people get hold of it. We had said that signed copies would be available because of all sorts of problems with travel and packaging and various things. At the moment, it's not been possible for us to get hold of signed copies per se, but if people who are on this forum now are able to order it through Amazon or any other bookshop and send us a acknowledgement that they have acquired it legitimately, we will be able to forward to you a signed book plate from Natan and Gil that will be able to be put into your books. So we'd hoped to be able to have books available, but we can't do that. If people acquire the books, we can get them. We can get the signatures to you, and I do commend the book. I have had the advantage now of reading a real copy, the Kindle copy, and the audio book, which is really, really good.
Well, when travel becomes a verb again, we'll be thrilled to come to the United Kingdom and maybe to your synagogue, not on a Shabbat, and sign copies. And you can hold one copy and give another copy to your best friend or to your children or grandchildren.
Excellent, excellent. Natan, Perek Lamed of Tehillim.
Okay, so here's the Sefer Tehillim. I will not read from it now because it's very small letters for me now, and my eyes are not strong enough. Do you see it? Yeah. And so it so happened that a few days before my arrest, some American tourists brought this book with a note from my wife, Avital, who was in Israel. And she said that for a long time she was traveling with this book, but she has a feeling that the time has come to send it to me. And I opened it. And what I can tell you, most of the words, it's very small letters, most of the words, or many of the words I don't know. And if you didn't learn how to read this text, you will not know where is the end and the beginning of the sentence, because there are no dots, no periods. And so I decided, look, I am too busy. It was very tense time. KGB man, my tails are always with me. I'm in demonstrations and press conferences. So I don't have time for these things. I put it aside, and then I was arrested a few days later. And then in the list of the things that they confiscated, there was written the small book, not in Russian, with the black cover. And I realized that's that book, and I remember the note of Avital that she feels the time has come to send to me. And I demanded that they'll bring it to me back. It took me 3 years to get it back. And I got it back together with the telegram that my father passed away. So what could I do? And I decided the only thing that I can do, I can read until I'll understand. And you have to understand, here are hundreds of thousands of words, and you don't know where is the end and the beginning of the sentence. And I try to simply, as a mathematician, to put all these words, the words that I know, in different places, and try to learn the connection with others. And it so happened that the very first phrase, which I understood fully from the beginning of the end, was from Psalm 23, Gam ki elech bagei tzar mavet, lo yirara ki ata imadi. You will go through the valley of death, will have no fear because you are with me. And who is you? It's King David, it's Avital, it's State of Israel, it's Kadosh Baruch Hu, it's all of them together. Come to my prison straight to support me. So you say not very religious. I don't know what's religious, not religious. It's exactly like miracle of Hanukkah. You know, the miracle and this feeling of the struggle, it goes all together. And that's how I felt about my conversations with God in prison. In fact, I had to tell you, Rabbi, the prison is punishing cell is the great place for direct conversation with God. And whenever I'm asked what, so are you religious or not religious? Are you secular or not? I say, you know what, if you tell me exactly after what mitzvah, there is Taryag mitzvot, after what mitzvah I'm turning from secular to religious. After 25, after 140, after 375, nobody can tell. So what you're telling me that my wife is religious, I'm secular, how you define where are these borders? We are all part of the same people who believe that in the image of God created man, whether we chose, God chose us or we chose God, who knows? But we all believe that we are created in the image of God and we are trying to be worthy of this choice. And that's our destiny. As to Mizmor Lamed, again, when I understood what it's about, I decided that when I'll be released, I have to read it. And so when in the airplane, I was already in the airplane when they told me that that huge airplane on the Iron 4 KGB man, judging by sun, we go to the west. It's clear that already we crossed the border of the Soviet Union. And I demand, am I kidnapped? Is it hijacking? What it is? And then they tell me that by the decision of Soviet government for the behavior not worthy of the Soviet citizen, I'm deprived of Soviet citizenship and exiled from Soviet Union. Then I made my final speech that I hope that all these people of the Soviet Union will become free one day. And as I decided before, and I opened the Tehillim, which was the only piece of property which I insisted to have with me leaving Soviet Union. I read Psalm Lamed. מזמור שיר חנוכת הבית לדוד. הרממך אדוני כדליתני, ולא שמחת אויבי לי. אדוני אלוהי שבעיתי אליך ותרפאני. אדוני גאלית מן שאול נפשי, ראיתני מירדי בור. זמרו לאדוני חסידיו, והודו לזכר קדשו. כי רגע באפו חיים, ברצונו בערב ילין בכי ולבוקר רינה. ואני אמרתי בשלבי, בל אמות לעולם. אדוני ברצונך העמדת להררי עוז, הסתרת פניך והייתי נבהל. אליך אדוני אלרע ואל אדוני אדחנו. מה בצע בדמי ברידתי אל שחת. אורך עפר תגיד עמיתך. שמע אדוני וענני. היה עוזר לי. הפכת מספידי למחול לי. פתחת שלו ותעזרני שמחה. למען יזמרך כבוד ולא ידם אדוני אלוהי לעולם עודך. טוב.
2,500 years old, those words. And yet read today and around the world as we're rebuilding our Jewish state and I'm living with greater Jewish freedoms and greater Jewish hope than any of our ancestors could have imagined. Those words read by somebody who had experienced the imprisonment of Joseph, the fear of the Jews of Babylon, had campaigned with the same tenacity as the Maccabees of old. There is a lovely statement, a sentence in the book that I think in the book Never Alone, that I think sums it up. Remember that you are a part of something bigger than yourself. Gil, Natan, thank you so much for sharing with us some wisdom this evening that reminds us what a large something is out there, and that how each individual one of us is able to play our part to make it bigger than ourselves and bigger than anything we might ever have dreamed by ourselves. So thank you both so much.
Thank you. Chag Sameach. Yesh Koach.
Chag Sameach.
Wish everybody a safe evening and a Chanukah Sameach and a Chodesh Tov. Bye.
Chodesh Tov.